My favourite types of things to paint are those ordinary snapshots of nature that we take for granted, that when we stop and look are just so beautiful, like sunlight coming through the trees, or the way that one single leaf can be highlighted in an otherwise shady spot. And this is what we'll have a go at in this short tutorial. We'll paint this lovely forest path with a few spots of that bright sunlight peeping through. The colours I use for this are titanium white, Payne's grey, primary red and primary yellow. Payne's grey has a little bit of a bluish tint to it, so it's perfect for our pale sky when mixed with some white. We can also use a mixture of Payne's grey and yellow to create a range of dull greens, and this will be a much better choice for creating realistic greens than we could get by mixing blue and yellow. This background layer has plenty of white mixed in all of the colours here. We want this to disappear off into the distance, and using paler grade colours is perfect for this. We don't need to create any detail at this stage. I'm using my wide flat brush to roughly block in the basic colours. There's the pale grey sky, a pale grey green for the most distant treetops, and then a dull olive green for everything else. And this darker green is just Payne's grey, primary yellow and a touch of white to give it that little cloudiness. With the page covered, we can begin to add a little detail in this most distant section. White plus some Payne's grey and yellow make our nice pale green again, and we can go over this area where the trees meet the sky. Use a small round or liner brush to pick out the tops of a few trees with some simple silhouettes. I want to show a pop of light here in the distance before I add some more tree trunks, so I've mixed a bright green with mostly yellow, a little Payne's grey to turn it to green, and then a little white to boost the opacity. I'm just flicking this up with the tip of my filbert brush so I don't get a harsh line along the top edge. And then I can use my small liner to add the dark grey silhouettes of those most distant tree trunks. Now let's add the basic shape of our path with a dark brown. We can mix this with a little red and yellow to make orange, and then Payne's grey to darken it to a warm brown. Make your path smaller in the distance and wider towards the bottom of the page. Now we're ready to start adding our dark foreground layers. Mix a dark green with Payne's grey and yellow, and use this to create some shadowy areas in the foreground. I've added a couple of dark patches to the right and darkened up most of this left side, especially near to this bottom corner. In the distant trees, we can give the impression of detail with a little dry brushing texture and our dark green. And anywhere you end up with a line that looks a little too harsh, just use a clean damp brush to fuss at the page, blending the lines away. If you've ever watched Bob Ross painting, this next bit is what he always called the bravery test. We'll paint a big dark line right in the middle of our scene. This is a dark brown again with just a little more Payne's grey in it, and we can paint a sprinkle of these trunks all over this distant section of our scene. Use a little cloudy greyish green to paint some simple silhouetted leaves on these tree trunks. Nothing fancy with these marks, just some little uneven clusters with the tip of a small round brush. Just make sure they're a little darker than the background behind them, and if necessary, as you work towards the outer edges of the page, add a little more Payne's grey to darken this colour. For the closest section of greenery, we can use a green without white mixed in, so just Payne's grey and primary yellow to create these basic foliage silhouettes. The smaller the brush is for this, the fussier your marks will look. I like a size 4 round brush. I get the suggestion of detail around the edges, but if I do want to cover a larger area, I can just squash the brush against the page. Once our shadowy shapes are in place, we can begin to pick out the details that create that sense of light. In the distance here where we have that nice bright patch, mix a bright yellow green with some yellow, a little Payne's grey and a little white. Use just the tip of a small round or a liner brush to make little clusters of marks that look like illuminated distant plants. Do this over a darker area to get that nice contrast against the shadowy green. We can create these patches of light through the trees with wherever we choose to add the lighter green, and you can add little blobs for leafy plants or grass-like brush strokes, building up the sense of illumination. For the dappled light on the path, we want a nice warm orangey brown, and then a little white to lift the value to that perfect sunlit path colour. A few spots with even more white will work great for the brightest areas, but less is more with this, so just 2 or 3 little areas will work best. Closer on the path, a little pale brown helps to establish some texture and some more subtle indications of light and shadows. We're on the home stretch now, and at this stage we'll use a little lighter green to begin to pick out the leafy limbs on the closest trees. Keep these marks on the darker areas of green so we get that nice contrast, and think about the shapes of the branches and how they swoop down. You can adjust your green a little as you go to create some natural variations, but we'll do this with a little white rather than yellow. We'll save our yellow for the sunlit branches that we'll add next. Our last step is to add some bright leaves in the foreground. These are catching the light so we can make them a vibrant yellow-green from the yellow and Payne's grey. I like a small round brush for leaves like this, one that I can control easily and create a variety of leafy clusters. You can use a liner to add the hint of a few branches in a pale brown, and then a few little blobs of dark green to replace some of the shadows that might have disappeared in the base of this bright plant. And at that, your beautiful forest path is done.